Arrogance rarely enters a courtroom with a shout. It doesn't scream, and it doesn't bang on tables. It walks in wearing a $3,000 custom-tailored suit, a gold Rolex peeking out from under the cuff, and a half-smile of pure pity reserved for anyone who doesn't belong to its world. It sits at the defense table, crosses its legs, and rolls its eyes around the room, as if trying to appraise exactly how much the place is worth. That is exactly how Richard Vance, a real estate mogul who owned over 40 luxury apartment complexes, stepped into Judge Judy's courtroom on a Tuesday morning. He didn't come alone. Beside him sat a high-priced lawyer, carrying a thick leather briefcase stuffed with complex legal documents, papers designed not to reveal the truth, but to bury it. But we are not at the ending yet. Not quite. Let me tell you what I saw before I tell you what actually happened. The case appeared on the docket as a standard civil dispute, a fight over a withheld security deposit. The amount in question was $10,000. For Richard Vance, $10,000 was nothing more than a business dinner and a few expensive bottles of wine. He didn't even blink when his lawyer mentioned the sum. But on the other side of the room, at the plaintiff's table, $10,000 took on an entirely different shape. It took the shape of Sarah Jenkins, a 22-year-old senior nursing student who worked night shifts at a roadside diner just to pay her tuition. She stood there wearing a frayed white button-down shirt, ironed as flat as humanly possible. Her hands were clasped so tightly together that her knuckles were entirely white from the tension. She looked up at the judge's bench with the eyes of someone backed into a corner, the eyes of a human being who had already calculated that if the legal system failed her one more time, she would lose absolutely everything. No tuition money, no place to live, and perhaps the very future she had traded her sleepless nights to build. Vance had kept her entire $10,000 deposit after she moved out. His excuse? Severe property damage. He presented a 15-page report, drafted by his own company, listing invisible scratches on the hardwood floors and non-existent water stains on the ceiling. When Vance's lawyer spoke, his voice was as smooth as oil. "Your Honor, my client simply followed the strict terms of the lease agreement. Miss Jenkins here was negligent in maintaining the property, and we have the full documentation to prove it." That lawyer was confident. Richard Vance was incredibly confident. They had run this exact play 100 times before. They knew exactly how to use the sheer weight of paperwork to exhaust poor tenants who couldn't afford legal representation. They firmly believed that if they just threw enough documents at the wall, the truth would automatically suffocate underneath. Judge Judy sat high on her bench, her glasses resting low on the bridge of her nose. She said absolutely nothing for the first 3 minutes. Her face was an instrument of the court completely devoid of emotion. That is what a veteran judge does. She let the lawyer speak. She let their smugness freely fill the room. But there was one crucial thing that Richard Vance and his expensive attorney failed to realize. This courtroom did not run on money, and it certainly did not run on randomly stamped papers. Inside Judge Judy's mind, a countdown clock had already started ticking. She had seen the worn collar of Sarah's shirt. She had seen the arrogant smirk on Vance's face. And after decades of sitting in that exact chair, she knew exactly what a $10,000 lie smelled like. That arrogance, at this very second, was speeding right toward a solid brick wall. The silence in the room was broken not by a voice, but by the sound of paper, the crisp, expensive sound of Richard Vance's lawyer sliding that 15-page report across the polished wood. It was more than just a document. It was a psychological weapon. It was thick, bound in a professional cover, and filled with high-resolution photographs of a small, one-bedroom apartment. To a casual observer, it looked like a clinical autopsy of a crime scene. To Judge Judy, it looked like a desperate attempt to make a mountain out of a molehill. "Look at Exhibit A, Your Honor," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity. This was the state of the living room floor. Scratches so deep they required a full sanding and refinishing. $3,000. Look at the kitchen. The countertops were stained beyond repair. Another $2,000. By the time we factored in the professional cleaning and the apparent negligence of the tenant, the $10,000 deposit didn't even cover the half of it. Richard Vance leaned back, checking his watch again. He wasn't even looking at Sarah. To him, she was a ghost, a minor inconvenience that had dared to summon him from his high-rise office. He was bored. He had played this game so many times that he already knew the ending, or so he thought. Judge Judy didn't look at the lawyer. She picked up the first photograph. She held it close to her eyes, then moved it away, her expression shifting from neutral to a cold, sharpened curiosity. Then she looked at Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was trembling. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her shoulders hunched as if trying to shield herself from the weight of the lies being told. Sarah, Judge Judy's voice cut through the lawyer's drone like a cold blade. Look at me. Sarah lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there was a flicker of something in them, not just fear, but a raw, burning sense of injustice. Did you cause these scratches? Judy asked, holding up the photo of a floor that looked perfectly normal to anyone, without a magnifying glass and a motive. No, Your Honor. Sarah's voice was small, but it didn't waver. I put felt pads on every single piece of furniture I owned. I treated that place like it was a palace because it was the only thing I had. I spent 3 hours on my hands and knees scrubbing those floors the day I left. I have my own photos, but I didn't know I needed a professional photographer to prove I didn't destroy a room. The lawyer let out a short, condescending huff of a laugh. Your Honor, a student's amateur cell phone photos can hardly compete with a professional property inspection report. Judy's hand went up, a single sharp motion that silenced him instantly. The room went dead quiet. I've been on this bench for a long time, counselor, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. I know the difference between a professional report and a predatory one. I'm looking at this photo of a kitchen counter. You're claiming a $2,000 replacement for a stain. But when I look at the timestamp on your professional photo, I see it was taken 3 weeks after Miss Jenkins moved out. Tell me, what happened in those 21 days? Did the dust suddenly turn into acid? Or did your client realize that $10,000 was exactly the amount he needed to refresh his rental unit on someone else's dime? Vance's smirk vanished. He uncrossed his legs. For the first time, he wasn't looking at his watch. He was looking at the woman on the bench, and he was realizing that the brick wall Sarah had been backed into was now standing right in front of him. The air in the courtroom didn't just turn cold, it turned heavy. You could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the oxygen seemed to leave the room as Judge Judy leaned forward, her eyes locked on to Richard Vance. For a man like Vance, being questioned wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult to his status. He was used to boardrooms where his word was law, where his signature moved millions, and where people like Sarah Jenkins were merely line items on a balance sheet. Mr. Vance, Judy said, her voice dropping to a level that signaled an approaching storm. You've heard the question. You have a professional report claiming $10,000 in damages. You have photos that show a counter needing replacement. But those photos were taken 21 days after this young woman handed you the keys. I want to know what happened in those 3 weeks. Did the apartment sit empty? Or did you have contractors in there doing a full renovation that you decided Sarah Jenkins was going to pay for? Vance cleared his throat, a sound of pure irritation. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't even look at his own lawyer. He looked at the ceiling, exhaling a long, weary breath, as if he were explaining a simple concept to a difficult child. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth but edged with a sharp, patronizing tone. My company manages thousands of units. We don't have time to fabricate damages. The inspection happens when the crew is available. If there are scratches on that floor, it's because she put them there. If the counter is stained, she stained it. $10,000 is a drop in the bucket for my firm. Why would I lie about such a trivial amount? Because you can, Judy snapped back, her gavel twitching on the bench. Because you've done it before, and no one had the spine or the money to call you on it. You see a trivial amount. I see a young woman's entire life savings. I see her tuition. I see the difference between her finishing nursing school or being forced to drop out because a billionaire wanted new marble countertops for his next tenant. She turned her gaze back to the professional report. She flipped a page, her finger tracing a line item for deep cleaning services $1,500. Then, she looked at the photos again. She noticed something, a small detail that Vance's high-priced legal team had overlooked in their rush to bury the truth under a mountain of paperwork. In the reflection of the microwave in one of the damaged photos, there was a man standing in the background. He wasn't a professional inspector. He was wearing a shirt with a logo that didn't match Vance's property management company. Judy's eyes sharpened. This was the crack in the foundation. She didn't reveal it yet. She wanted to see how far Vance would go. She wanted to see if he would double down on the lie, or if the weight of his own arrogance would finally cause him to stumble. Mr. Vance, she said softly, a tone that should have made his blood run cold. Are you absolutely sure, under penalty of perjury, that these photos represent the exact condition the apartment was in the moment Sarah Jenkins walked out that door? Vance didn't hesitate. He gave a sharp, confident nod. Absolutely, Your Honor. My word is my bond." The room went silent. Sarah held her breath, her eyes filled with a desperate hope that someone, for the first time in her life, would see through the polished exterior of power. Judge Judy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a predator who had just watched its prey walk directly into the trap. The courtroom remained hushed, the kind of silence that feels like the air before a lightning strike. Judge Judy didn't move. She didn't look at the lawyers. She simply stared at the photograph in her hand, the one Richard Vance had just sworn, under penalty of perjury, was a true and accurate representation of the apartment the day Sarah Jenkins moved out. "Mr. Vance," Judy said, her voice now a low, dangerous purr. "You're a very successful man. You own 40 complexes. You have hundreds, maybe thousands of tenants. You hire the best lawyers. You clearly pay a lot of attention to the big picture. But in my courtroom, the big picture is made of very, very small details." She picked up a magnifying glass from her desk. The lawyer for Vance shifted his weight, his polished shoes clicking nervously on the floor. Sarah Jenkins leaned forward, her heart visible through the thin fabric of her shirt, thumping against her ribs. "Let's look at Exhibit C," Judy continued. "This is the photo of the kitchen. You claim the countertops were ruined by stains. It's a very clear photo. High resolution, professional. But there's something interesting about high-resolution photos, Mr. Vance. They catch things you didn't intend to show." She turned the photo toward Vance, pointing a sharp, manicured finger at the glossy surface of the microwave sitting on the counter. "In the reflection of this microwave," she said, her voice rising in power, "I see a man. He's holding the camera. He's wearing a bright blue polo shirt with a yellow logo. I've seen that logo before. It doesn't belong to your property management company. It belongs to Elite Granite and Marble Restorations, a company that specializes in installing new kitchens, not inspecting old ones." Vance's face went from a tanned, healthy glow to a pale, waxy gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lawyer scrambled, flipping through his own notes. "But here's the real problem for you, Mr. Vance," Judy said, her eyes flashing with a cold fire. "I had my clerk look up Elite Granite and Marble while you were busy telling me how honest you are. They didn't visit that apartment on the day Sarah moved out. They visited it 2 weeks later to give you a quote for a full renovation. This photo wasn't taken to document damage. This photo was taken to show the contractors what the old kitchen looked like before you ripped it out to make the unit luxury for the next tenant." She slammed the photo down on the bench. The sound was like a gunshot. "You didn't just withhold her deposit," Judy barked. "You manufactured evidence. You took a photo of a kitchen mid-renovation and tried to pass it off as damage caused by a student who was working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over her head. You sat there, under oath, and lied to my face because you thought I wouldn't look closely enough. You thought she was too small to matter, and I was too busy to notice." Vance finally found his voice, but it was thin and shaky. "Your Honor, there must be a misunderstanding with the filing. My staff handled the photos." "Don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining," Judy shouted, the classic line cutting through his excuse like a chainsaw. "You signed the affidavit. You stood there and told me your word was your bond. Well, Mr. Vance, your bond is worth about as much as those fake scratches on your floor." Sarah Jenkins let out a sob, not of sadness, but of pure, overwhelming relief. The wall was no longer in front of her. It had just collapsed on the man who built it. The courtroom air was thick with the scent of a crumbling reputation. Richard Vance, a man who likely hadn't been told no in 20 years, looked like he was suffocating. His lawyer was frantically whispering in his ear, hands shuffling through the evidence that had just been exposed as a sham. But the whispering didn't matter. The only voice that carried weight in this room belonged to the woman sitting behind the bench. "Save your breath, counselor," Judy said, her eyes never leaving Vance. "Your client didn't have a clerical error. He had a greed error. He looked at a nursing student and saw a line of credit. He looked at a security deposit and saw a way to pay for his next upgrade. It's a classic move, Mr. Vance. You think because you own the building, you own the truth. But let me remind you, this is my building, and the truth is the only currency I accept." Sarah was shaking, but for the first time, her head was held high. She reached into her worn backpack and pulled out a small, cracked tablet. "Your Honor," she said, her voice finally finding its strength, "I don't have a professional team, but I have a grandmother who told me to never trust a man who smiles too much when he's taking your money. The day I moved out, I didn't just take photos. I recorded a video. I walked through every room. I even filmed the microwave." The lawyer jumped up, his voice cracking. "Your Honor, This is undocumented evidence. We haven't had time to review this. Sit down, Judy barked, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. You've had 6 months to review the lies you put in your own report. I think we can spare 3 minutes for the truth. The court clerk took the tablet and connected it to the monitors. The screen flickered to life. On the video, Sarah's voice could be heard, shaky but clear. She was walking through the living room. The hardwood floors, the ones Vance claimed were deeply scratched, were glowing in the afternoon sun. They were pristine. She panned to the kitchen. The countertops were spotless. She even opened the microwave, showing it was as clean as the day she moved in. But the real smoking gun came at the end of the video. Sarah walked to the front door, and as she stepped out, she panned the camera to the hallway. There, standing by the elevator, were 2 men in blue polo shirts with the Elite Granite and Marble logo. They were carrying measuring tapes and clipboards. One of them looked at the camera and said, "We're here for the renovation in 4B. The owner wants the whole place gutted by Friday." The video ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard Vance looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. His lawyer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. The professional report that had been the centerpiece of their case was now nothing more than a confession of fraud. Judge Judy leaned back, a terrifyingly calm smile playing on her lips. "Gutted by Friday, Mr. Vance? That's interesting, because according to your sworn statement, you spent $10,000 repairing damages. You don't repair a floor you're about to rip out. You don't replace a counter that's scheduled for the dumpster. You stole that money, plain and simple. You saw a student with no resources, and you decided to rob her to pad your profit margin." She turned her gaze to Sarah, her expression softening just a fraction, the only mercy Sarah would see today. "Miss Jenkins, you did exactly what you were supposed to do. You protected yourself. And Mr. Vance, you're about to learn that in this courtroom your bank account doesn't give you a license to lie." The silence that followed the video wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a controlled demolition, where the dust is still hanging in the air and everyone is waiting to see if anything is left standing. Richard Vance was still standing, but he looked smaller. The $3,000 suit didn't seem to fit him as well as it did 10 minutes ago. His lawyer was staring at the floor, his professional briefcase now looking like a box of scrap paper. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked disgusted. And for a man like Richard Vance, who spent his life being envied or feared, being looked at with disgust by a woman who held his fate in her hands, was a new, terrifying experience. "Mr. Vance," Judy said, her voice barely above a whisper, which in her courtroom was far more dangerous than a shout, "you signed an affidavit. You stood in front of that officer. You raised your right hand, and you swore that every word in this 15-page report was the truth. You swore those scratches existed. You swore that counter was ruined. You swore you spent $10,000 to restore this unit to its original condition." She picked up the report and held it between 2 fingers, as if it were a piece of rotting garbage. "But the video we just saw, the video that was taken after you claimed the damage occurred, shows a different story. It shows a perfectly clean apartment, and more importantly, it shows contractors from a granite company waiting to gut the place. You didn't spend $10,000 to repair Sarah's damage. You spent it to upgrade your property for the next high-paying tenant, and you thought you could trick a 22-year-old girl into paying for your investment." Vance's lawyer finally found his voice, though it sounded thin and strained. "Your Honor, if I may, my client oversees a massive operation. He relies on his site managers. If there was an inaccuracy in the reporting, it was an administrative oversight, not an intentional—" "Stop!" Judy's hand cut through the air. "Don't tell me it's an oversight. An oversight is forgetting to sign a check. This is a conspiracy to commit fraud. This is using the legal system as a weapon to rob a student of her life savings. You're a lawyer, counselor. You know exactly what happens when a witness provides manufactured evidence to a court of law. It's called perjury. And in my world, perjury isn't an administrative oversight. It's a crime." She turned her eyes back to Vance. He was sweating now, a thin line of moisture appearing at his hairline. The mogul was gone. In his place was a man who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, except the cookie was a young woman's future. "You thought she was an easy target, didn't you?" Judy asked, her voice sharpening. "You thought she'd see your lawyer, see your suit, and just walk away. You thought she'd be too intimidated to fight back. You counted on her being poor. You counted on her being powerless. But you forgot one very important thing, Mr. Vance." She leaned forward, her eyes pinning him to his seat. In this room, the only thing that has power is the truth. And right now, the truth is making you look very, very expensive. Sarah Jenkins was no longer crying. She was watching Vance, her face set in a mask of quiet realization. She wasn't just winning a case, she was watching a giant fall. And for everyone in the gallery, for every person who had ever been cheated by a landlord or bullied by someone with a bigger bank account, this was the moment they had been waiting for. Judge Judy didn't just drop the hammer, she dismantled the entire platform Richard Vance was standing on. She leaned over the bench, her eyes as sharp as a hawk's, focusing on the man who thought his bank account made him invincible. The silence in the courtroom was no longer heavy. It was suffocating for the defense and electric for the girl who had spent months crying herself to sleep over a debt she didn't owe. "Mr. Vance," Judy began, her voice now dangerously calm, "I want you to take a good look at this young woman. You saw her as an easy mark. You saw her as a line item on a ledger that you could erase to pay for your kitchen upgrades. You didn't just withhold her deposit, you attempted to steal her future. You sat there under oath and committed the most cardinal sin of this courtroom. You lied to me with the confidence of a man who thinks he owns the truth." Vance tried to speak, his hand reaching for the microphone, but his lawyer grabbed his arm, shaking his head. It was too late. The trap had already snapped shut. "In the state where this lease was signed," Judy continued, her voice rising in authority, "the law is very clear about security deposits. They are not a bonus for the landlord. They are not a renovation fund. They are the tenant's property, held in trust. And when a landlord acts in bad faith, when they manufacture evidence and lie about damages, the law doesn't just ask for the money back, it demands a penalty." She turned to Sarah, who was standing as still as a statue, tears finally beginning to track down her face. "Sarah," Judy said, her tone softening just enough to show the humanity behind the black robe, "you worked night shifts, you saved every penny, you did everything right, and this man tried to use his power to crush you. But today, power didn't win. Character did." Judy turned back to Vance, and the fire returned to her eyes. "Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $10,000 for the return of the deposit. But we aren't stopping there. Because of the documented bad faith and the manufactured evidence presented to this court, I am awarding the maximum statutory penalty, treble damages. That is $30,000, Mr. Vance. You wanted $10,000 of hers? Now you're giving her $30,000 of yours?" Vance's jaw dropped. The mogul looked like he had been struck. $30,000 was still a drop in the bucket for him. But the public humiliation, the recorded judgment of fraud, and the look of pure defeat on his face told a different story. His reputation, the thing he valued more than the money, was in tatters. "And counselor," Judy added, looking directly at the high-priced lawyer, "I'll be forwarding the transcript of this hearing, along with that professional report, to the district attorney's office for an investigation into perjury and the falsification of evidence. I suggest you find a very good lawyer for yourself, Mr. Vance. You're going to need one." The gavel came down. Bang. The sound echoed like a final verdict on a life built on bullying the weak. But as Judy looked at Sarah, the story wasn't over. There was one final lesson to be learned, one final moment that would define the difference between having wealth and having worth. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood was final, but the echoes lasted much longer. In the quiet that followed, Richard Vance didn't move. He sat paralyzed, staring at the polished table that suddenly felt like a cage. $30,000. To a man of his stature, it was a manageable loss. But the label fraud now attached to his name was a stain that no amount of money could wash away. He had walked in as a king of industry. He was walking out as a cautionary tale. Judge Judy began to gather her papers, her movements methodical and calm. She looked down at Sarah Jenkins one last time. Sarah was still standing, her hands no longer trembling, her eyes clear. The weight that had been crushing her chest for months, the fear of debt, the shame of being cheated, the anxiety of a ruined future had vanished. "Miss Jenkins," Judy said, her voice softer now, devoid of the courtroom thunder, "take that money, finish your degree, become the best nurse you can be. This world needs people who know the value of hard work and people who have the courage to stand up when someone tries to steal it from them." Sarah nodded, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for listening." "I didn't just listen, Sarah," Judy replied, looking toward the back of the room where Vance's lawyer was hurriedly packing his bags. "I watched, and I saw exactly who was telling the truth before a single word was spoken. As the bailiff announced the recess, the gallery began to clear. Richard Vance stood up, attempting to regain some shred of his former dignity. He adjusted his tie and smoothed his expensive jacket, but as he turned to leave, he found himself walking past Sarah. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. Vance looked for a way to sneer, a way to reclaim his superiority, but he found nothing. In Sarah's eyes, there was no hatred, only a quiet, profound pity. She was the one with the power now. Outside the courtroom, the sun was shining on the courthouse steps. For Sarah, the air smelled different. It smelled like freedom. She had walked into that building with nothing but a cracked tablet and a frayed shirt. She walked out with $30,000 and something far more valuable: the knowledge that the untouchables are only untouchable as long as no one dares to touch them. The story of Richard Vance and Sarah Jenkins isn't just about a security deposit. It's a reminder that arrogance has a price, and truth has a way of finding the light, even when buried under 15 pages of lies. It reminds us that no matter how high you build your towers or how expensive your suits are, you are never above the law. In Judge Judy's court, the tall buildings don't matter, the bank accounts don't matter. All that matters is the answer to one simple question: are you telling the truth? Because if you aren't, you'd better be prepared for the fall. And as Richard Vance learned today, the higher you are, the harder you hit the ground.